The Cold War, lasting from the end of the Second World War in 1945 to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, was one of the most dangerous periods in human history. For nearly 5 decades, the Communist East and Capitalist West eyed each other suspiciously across the Iron Curtain, precariously balanced on the brink of nuclear Armageddon. Numerous intercontinental ballistic missiles sat ready in their silos, nuke-equipped submarines prowled the oceans, while nuclear-armed strategic bombers patrolled the skies, all ready at a moment's notice to unleash their apocalyptic payloads. With so much nuclear ordnance flying about, accidents could and did happen, but none of these close calls were as horrifyingly close as a 1961 accident that nearly turned the entire U.S. state of North Carolina into a radioactive wasteland, and the massive loss of life that would have come with that, and was only prevented from doing so by a single, shockingly crude electrical component. This is the disturbing story of the 1961 Goldsboro B-52 crash. Just before we get back to the not once, not twice, but 3 times North Carolina had a nuke dropped on them, and the 2 instances where the bombs came insanely close to detonating, you know who's not going to accidentally nuke a state? Today's sponsor, Plod Note. For those unfamiliar, the Plod Note is a tiny, credit card size, ultra thin, just 0.29 centimeters thick note taker made from sleek aluminum that attaches to your phone like it was born there. Slide the switch up to record calls, Zoom, WhatsApp, phone calls, all of it. Slide it down to record what's happening around you, conversations, school lectures, business meetings, random 2 a.m. ideas, all captured in an ultra high quality recording. No tapping through menus, no app juggling, no worrying about your phone dying or app crashing or any such shenanigans. Just one button press and done. On top of that, the Plod Note is also ultra secure with your recordings stored with SOC-2 and HIPAA level protection, powered by AWS, which means your data stays safe, private, and unlike many recording services, it's never for sale. On top of that, the Plod Note also has industry-leading transcription in 112 languages, and not just okay-ish transcripts, these are detailed, speaker-labeled, neatly organized transcripts that actually make sense. So go ahead, record your French class or that angry voice note from your mom. It'll figure out her inane babbling and will even summarize it for you, pulling out what matters, decisions, deadlines, a bulleted list of her opinions on where your life went wrong. On top of that, it comes with Ask AI, where you can enter questions like how many more whips did Simon say he needs to keep the basement dwellers in line, and it will figure out what recording that was covered in and jump to that exact moment where it was discussed. No more getting that wrong and Simon turning one of the whips on you for your mistake. The Plod Note will also run for a ridiculous 30 hours on a single charge with about a 2-month standby, and as for storage, it has 64 gigabytes, which is good for almost 500 hours of recordings. Exporting and sharing those recordings is also insanely easy for seamless collaboration with others. So if you've got meetings to survive, clients to impress with never forgetting details, school lectures to capture and summarize, or just thoughts to catch before they vanish, click the link in the description below to get 10% off your own Plod Note. Now let's get back to the insane number of times the US almost accidentally nuked something in probably the biggest Whoopsa-Doodle in modern military history. At 7 a.m. on August 29, 1949, a blinding flash seared the sky over Kazakhstan, and a dark mushroom cloud rose into the air as the Soviet Union detonated RDS-1, its first atomic bomb. Made possible by communist agents embedded in the Manhattan Project, the test came years ahead of Western predictions and shattered the nascent American nuclear monopoly. Just 2 years before, the USSR introduced its first long-range intercontinental bomber, a reverse-engineered copy of the wartime American Boeing B-29 Superfortress called the Tupolev Tu-4 Bull. For the first time in history, the North American continent was truly vulnerable to an aerial attack. In response, the U.S. Air Force greatly expanded its recently created Nuclear Delivery Wing, Strategic Air Command, or SAC. Initially, SAC was equipped with an upgraded version of the B-29 called the B-50. This had a relatively short range of just 4,000 kilometers or 2,500 miles, forcing it to be deployed from forward bases such as Goose Bay, Labrador, in order to reach targets in the Soviet Union. However, it soon began to be replaced by the more modern and capable Convair B-36 Peacemaker, nicknamed the Aluminum Overcast. The gargantuan B-36 was one of the largest military aircraft ever deployed, measuring a whopping 50 meters or 164 feet long, with a wingspan of 70 meters or 230 feet, and powered by no fewer than 6 28-cylinder, 2,800 kilowatt or 3,800 horsepower Pratt & Whitney WAS Major radial engines. Later versions added 4 23 kilonewton or 5,200 pound thrust General Electric J47 turbojet engines, inspiring the nickname 6 turning, 4 burning. Originally designed near the end of the Second World War to bomb targets in Europe from bases in North America, the B-36 had a combat range of 6,400 kilometers or 4,000 miles, giving SAC a global reach, and had a payload of 4,500 kilograms or 10,000 pounds, allowing it to carry the first generation of thermonuclear or hydrogen bombs. Versions were also used as long-range reconnaissance platforms as well as testbeds for various technologies, including airborne nuclear reactors. The B-36 entered service with SAC in 1948, and within only 2 years, one was involved in one of history's first nuclear weapons mishaps. In the early morning hours of February 14, 1915, a B-36 from the 7th Bombardment Wing encountered carburetor icing over the coast of British Columbia, causing 3 of its 6 engines to shut down. The aircraft was en route from Ellison Air Force Base in Alaska to Carswell Air Force Base in Texas on a training mission that included a simulated bombing run over San Francisco. To lighten the aircraft, the crew decided to jettison their weapon, a single Mark IV atomic bomb with an explosive yield of 21 kilotons of TNT. Similar to the Fat Man device dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, the Mark IV was better optimized for mass production and maintenance and included the brand new safety feature of in-flight pit insertion, or IFI. Ordinarily, the spherical 6.2 kilogram or 14-pound plutonium core, or pit, was carried separately in a special container nicknamed the birdcage and only inserted into the bomb just prior to release. This was to prevent the 2,300 kilogram or 5,000 pounds of conventional explosives in the bomb from scattering the plutonium in the event of a crash, fire, or other accident. In this case, the aircraft carried only a dummy lead core, as until 1951, all real plutonium cores remained in the custody of the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC. As a result, the conventional explosives aboard the bomb detonated harmlessly over the inside passage. However, despite the reduced weight, it wasn't enough, and the order was given for the crew to bail out. The unmanned aircraft then continued to fly for some distance until finally crashing into the side of Mount Colleget in northern British Columbia. The Canadian military immediately launched a rescue mission and succeeded in recovering 12 of the 17 crew. One of the remaining 5, the weaponeer in charge of the Mark IV bomb, failed to bail out, however, and was lost in the crash, while the remaining 4 are thought to have parachuted into the Pacific Ocean and died of hypothermia. This crash marked the world's first broken arrow, U.S. military terminology for any incident involving the loss or destruction of nuclear weapons that does not create the risk of a nuclear war. Other related terms include dull sword, minor incidents that impair the deployment or effectiveness of nuclear weapons, empty quiver, the seizure, loss, or theft of functional nuclear weapons, and nuke flash, the accidental detonation of a nuclear warhead. But while the 1950 B-36 crash was the first broken arrow, it was certainly not the last. Indeed, a whopping 4 more serious incidents would take place in that year alone. On April 11, 1950, a Boeing B-50 Superfortress carrying a Mark IV nuclear bomb crashed shortly after takeoff from Kirtland Air Force Base near Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the end killing all 13 aboard. While the bomb was destroyed in the ensuing fire, its plutonium core was stored separately and recovered intact. On July the 13th, another B-50 carrying a Mark IV bomb made an unexplained nosedive into the ground during a routine training mission out of Biggs Air Force Base, Ohio, killing all 16 aboard. There was no plutonium core aboard that aircraft, but the conventional explosives in the bomb detonated on impact. On August the 5th, a B-50 en route from Guam experienced mechanical troubles and crashed while attempting to make an emergency landing at Fairfield-Suisun Air Force Base in California. 12 of the 20 men aboard were killed, along with 7 rescue crew, when the aircraft's unarmed Mark IV bomb exploded. Finally, on November the 10th, a B-50 flying out of Goose Bay, Labrador, encountered engine trouble near Rivière-du-Loup, Quebec. The crew jettisoned their unarmed Mark IV bomb, which detonated harmlessly over the St. Lawrence River. Thankfully, the aircraft made a successful landing at Loring Air Force Base in Maine and nobody was hurt. But while the B-50 and the B-36 were state-of-the-art when first introduced, the rapid advance of Cold War technology soon rendered them obsolete. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 saw the combat debut of the Soviet MiG-15 jet fighter, whose high speed, rate of climb, and service ceiling made the lumbering piston-engine bombers extremely vulnerable. Various solutions were explored, such as equipping these aircraft with their own parasite escort fighters carried in the bomb bay or attached to the wingtips, but these all proved unworkable. Nonetheless, the B-36 remained in service until 1959, racking up several more accidents in the process. Among the worst took place on May the 22nd, 1957, when a B-36 on approach to Kirtland Air Force Base near Albuquerque accidentally released a 15-megaton Mark 17 thermonuclear bomb at an altitude of 500 meters. Though the bomb's core was not fitted, the conventional explosives detonated on impact, blasting a crater 8 meters wide. However, by this time the giant Peacemaker had been largely replaced in SAC service by the revolutionary Boeing B-47 Stratojet, the world's first pure jet-powered intercontinental range bomber. Fitted with sleek swept wings, a brand new technology at the time, and powered by 6 32 kilonewton or 7,200 pound thrust General Electric J47 turbojet engines, the B-47 could reach an unprecedented top speed of 980 kilometers per hour or 600 miles per hour and a maximum altitude of 12,300 meters or 40,500 feet, placing it out of reach of Soviet intercept aircraft and anti-aircraft missiles, and could carry up to 11,300 kilograms or 25,000 pounds of ordnance out to a range of 3,200 kilometers or 2,000 miles, though this could be extended indefinitely using in-flight refueling. Like the B-36 and B-50 before it, several B-47s were also modified for use as long-range surveillance platforms. Unusually compared to previous and subsequent bombers, the Stratojet featured a fighter-style cockpit with the pilot and co-pilot seated one behind the other and a separate compartment in the nose for the navigator or bombardier. The B-47 first entered service with the United States Air Force in 1951 with over 2,000 aircraft, eventually equipping 116 squadrons based across the lower 48 U.S. states and forward air bases in Alaska, Guam, Spain, the UK, North Africa, and Greenland. However, the aircraft's cutting-edge technology and performance came at a cost, and in service, the B-47 proved troublesome to operate. Due to the inefficiency of its engines, the aircraft had to fly at high altitudes of around 11,000 meters or 35,000 feet to achieve intercontinental ranges. This, in turn, placed the wings in what is known as the coffin corner, a condition in which the difference between stall speed and critical Mach number, where lift-destroying shock waves start to form on the wings, was only around 10 kilometers or 6 miles per hour. This required the pilot to carefully monitor the aircraft's airspeed during cruise, making it exhausting to fly over long patrols. The same problem also plagued other high-altitude jet aircraft like the legendary Lockheed U-2 spy plane. In addition, the B-47 was underpowered at takeoff, often requiring the use of strap-on jet-assisted takeoff or JATO rocket motors to get off the ground with a full load, and had a hair-raising high landing speed and a tendency to float or porpoise on touchdown. The narrow-track landing gear was also unstable and often sent the aircraft skidding off the runway. Thanks to these and other problems, the B-47's service history was marred by dozens of incidents and accidents of varying severity, with 203 aircraft and 464 crew being lost between 1951 and 1969. Even worse, a handful of these incidents involved nuclear weapons. For example, on March the 10th, 1956, 4 B-47s of the 369th Bomb Squadron of the 306th Bombardment Wing took off from MacDill Air Force Base near Tampa, Florida, and headed northeast over the Atlantic Ocean, bound for Ben Guerir Air Force Base in Morocco. Aboard each aircraft were 2 nuclear weapon cores packed in transport cases. After completing the first 2 planned in-flight refueling off the Azores Islands, the bombers proceeded east over the Mediterranean and descended to 4,300 meters near Oran in Algeria to rendezvous with another flight of Boeing KC-97 Stratofighter refueling aircraft. But when they emerged through the cloud cover, one of the 4 bombers, bearing call sign Inkspot 59 and manned by pilot 2nd Lieutenant Ronald A. Kurtz, co-pilot Captain Robert H. Hodgkin, and bombardier and navigator Captain Gordon M. Inslee, was nowhere to be seen. and further could not be contacted over the radio. A French news agency reported an aircraft having exploded in midair near Sabata in Morocco, yet despite exhaustive searches by the US Air Force, Spanish and French troops, and elements of the British Royal Navy, neither the aircraft, its crew, nor the 2 nuclear weapon cores were ever recovered. The cause of this disappearance remains a mystery to this day. Just 4 months later, on July the 27th, 1956, an even more serious incident occurred at RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk, England, when a B-47 of the 307th Bombardment Wing veered off the runway and slammed into a concrete weapons storage bunker, or igloo, containing 3 Mark VI nuclear bombs. A further evolution of the Mark III and Mark IV Fat Man design, the Mark VI could be configured to deliver an explosive yield of either 18, 26, 80, 154, or 160 kilotons of TNT. While the collision killed all 4 men aboard the aircraft, ripped open the igloo, and showered the bombs inside with blazing jet fuel, miraculously the conventional explosives aboard the bombs did not detonate, nor were the bombs fitted with their plutonium cores, which were stored in a separate igloo some distance away. More serious incidents followed in quick succession. On October the 11th, 1957, a B-47 carrying a Mark 15 thermonuclear bomb crashed during takeoff from Homestead Air Force Base in Florida and burst into flames. Introduced in 1955, the Mark 15 Mod 0 was the first practically deliverable thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb in the U.S. arsenal, weighing 3,400 kilograms or 7,600 pounds with an explosive yield of 1.7 megatons, more than 100 times the power of the Little Boy bomb dropped in Hiroshima. In this case, the bomb was in ferry configuration with its core removed, but the conventional explosive detonated after burning for 2 hours. 3 months later, on January the 31st, 1958, a wheel failure caused a B-47 carrying a 6 megaton Mark 36 thermonuclear bomb to strike its tail on the runway at Sidi Silmain Air Base in Morocco and burst into flames. The bomb did not detonate, but it and the airframe burned for 7 hours, melting into a slab of radioactive metal that had to be broken apart with jackhammers and buried nearby for safety. The following month, on February the 28th, a B-47 experienced control issues shortly after takeoff from RAF Greenham Common in the UK, prompting the pilot to jettison his still full external fuel tanks. The tanks impacted another B-47 parked on the ground, touching off a fire that burned for 16 hours, killing 2 and injuring 8. Mercifully, the 1.1 megaton B-28 nuclear bomb aboard the aircraft did not detonate. However, the next major incident on U.S. soil involving the B-47 took place on the night of February the 4th to the 5th, 1958. That night, 2 bombers from MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, call signs Ivory 1 and Ivory 2, were flying a simulated combat mission off the coast of Georgia, each carrying a single Mark 15 Mod 0 thermonuclear bomb. Also in the air that morning were 2 North American F-86D Sabre fighter jets of the South Carolina Air National Guard, tasked with performing a mock interception of the 2 bombers. At around 9 a.m. local time on February the 5th, disaster struck when one of the Sabres, piloted by Lieutenant Clarence Stewart, collided with Ivory 2, crewed by Pilot Major Howard Richardson, co-pilot First Lieutenant Robert Lagerstrom, and Navigator Captain Leland Woolard at an altitude of 10,700 meters or 35,000 feet. As Major Richardson later recalled, "All of a sudden we felt a heavy jolt and a burst of flame out to the right. We didn't know what it was. We thought maybe it was something from outer space, but it could only be another plane." The impact severely damaged Ivory 2's right wing spar and knocked its outboard right engine askew, making the aircraft extremely difficult to control. Meanwhile, both wings of the Sabre were ripped off, forcing Lieutenant Stewart to eject. Despite suffering frostbitten hands from the altitude, he parachuted safely to the earth near Estill, South Carolina. Meanwhile, Ivory 2 spiraled towards the ground. While the crew were equipped with ejection seats, Major Richardson ordered them to remain aboard until, miraculously, he regained control of his aircraft at an altitude of 6,100 meters or 20,000 feet. However, the damage to the right wing made the B-47 too heavy to land safely, so Richardson requested, and was granted, permission to jettison his weapon, which he did over Wassaw Sound off the coast of Tybee Island, 29 kilometers or 18 miles east of Savannah, Georgia. He then managed to guide his heavily damaged aircraft to a safe emergency landing at Hunter Air Force Base south of Savannah, a feat of airmanship for which he was later awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Meanwhile, despite 2 months of searching by more than 100 men of the U.S. Navy and the Air Force's 2700th Explosive Ordnance Disposal Squadron, no sign of the jettisoned bomb was ever found, and it was officially declared lost on April 16, 1958. In the nearly 70 years since the Tybee Island incident, controversy has surrounded the status of the lost bomb. The official Air Force report stated that the weapon was an unarmed practice device containing high explosives but no plutonium core. However, in 2004, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and amateur historian Derek Duke uncovered a 1966 letter, declassified in 1994, recounting testimony delivered by Jack Howard, Assistant to the Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, to a joint congressional committee on atomic energy. In a closed-door hearing, Howard presented to the committee a list of complete and incomplete nuclear weapons which had been lost by the Air Force. Included in the former category was the Tybee Island bomb. Adding to Duke's suspicion was Howard Nixon, a former ordnance leader at Hunter Air Force Base from 1957 to 1959, who stated that, "Never in my Air Force career did I load a nuclear weapon without installing a nuclear capsule in it first." In response to this shocking revelation, Pentagon spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Campbell clarified that Howard's testimony had been mistaken, stating that, "We have discussed this letter with Mr. Howard and he agrees that the accident should have been categorized as one involving a weaponless capsule." However, Duke remains unconvinced, arguing that, "Are you telling me that the right-hand man to the Secretary of Defense, with all the resources of the Department of Defense, gets a detail like that wrong to a congressional investigation that is taking the issue of lost bombs very seriously? McNamara would have eaten Howard alive if he had been that sloppy." More to the point, in the words of Tybee Island City Manager Tom Cannon, "You tell me this, 40 years ago, why did they spend 2 months looking for a bomb if it was a fake?" Thus, while the Air Force continues to deny it, there remains a possibility that somewhere off the coast of North Carolina, buried under several feet of silt, lies a complete, fully functional 1.7 megaton thermonuclear weapon. However, while the aforementioned incidents were certainly alarming, they thankfully posed little risk to civilians. This was not the case with an incident which took place just 1 month after the Tybee Island collision on March 11, 1958. At 4:34 p.m., 3 B-47s of the 375th Bombardment Squadron of the 308th Bombardment Wing took off from Hunter Air Force Base outside Savannah, Georgia, and headed across the Atlantic Ocean to participate in Operation Snow Flurry. Officially designated a unit-simulated combat mission and special weapons exercise, Snow Flurry required participating aircraft to fly north and refuel off the coast of Newfoundland before crossing the Atlantic to make mock bombing runs over targets in the UK, where ground-based radio sensors would gauge the accuracy of the attacks. The bombers were then to turn south and land at one of 4 SAC forward air bases in North Africa. The entire mission would last an exhausting 18 hours. All 3 aircraft were armed with a single Mark VI nuclear bomb of the type involved in the 1956 RAF Lakenheath incident, their plutonium cores stored separately in a birdcage container. Around half-hour after takeoff, one of the B-47s, call sign Garfield 13, and crewed by Pilot Captain Earl Kohler, co-pilot Captain Charles Woodruff, and Bombardier Navigator Captain Bruce Kolka, ran into trouble when Captain Kohler pulled a lever to insert a locking pin into his bomb's suspension harness, preventing it from dropping if the pneumatically actuated shackle release failed. When a warning light indicated that the pin failed to insert, Kohler ordered Captain Kolka into the bomb bay to insert the pin manually. This was easier said than done, however. Not only was the bomb bay unpressurized, forcing Kolka to don a portable oxygen tank and mask, but the hatch to access the bay was too narrow for him to wear a parachute. Worse still, Kolka was vertically challenged and the locking mechanism was located high atop the bomb, just out of his reach. Like something out of a comedy skit, while struggling to insert the pin, Kolka was thrown off balance by some turbulence and, while reaching for something to steady himself with, accidentally grabbed the emergency bomb release handle. He then watched in horror as the bomb dropped free of its suspension shackle, broke through the closed bomb bay doors, and plummeted to the ground 4,600 meters or 15,000 feet below. It could have been even worse for himself, but miraculously, Kolka managed to grab hold of a canvas bag hung inside the bomb bay and thus narrowly avoided suffering the same fate as bomb-riding cowboy pilot Major T.J. King Kong in the classic 1964 film Dr. Strangelove. Meanwhile, the bomb landed in a swampy ground near the small community of Mars Bluff, around 10 kilometers or 6.5 miles east of Florence, South Carolina. Though the bomb was not fitted with its plutonium core and thus could not have undergone a nuclear chain reaction, the 2,300 kilograms or 5,000 pounds of high explosives nonetheless detonated on impact, blasting a crater around 21 meters or 70 feet wide. The house closest to the impact site belonged to railway conductor and former U.S. Army paratrooper Walter Gregg and his family. At the time, Gregg and his wife Ethel May were inside the house while their 2 young daughters, Helen and Frances, and niece Ella Davies were playing in the backyard. As Gregg later recalled in a New York Times interview, "About 5 seconds after I saw the aircraft go over, there was an explosion. It blew out the side and the top of the garage just as my boy ran inside with me. The timbers were falling around us, there was a green, foggy haze around us, and then a big black cloud of smoke. It lasted about 30 seconds. When it cleared up, I looked at the house, the top was blown in and a side was blown off. I saw the other children on the other side of the house, about 100 yards from where the bomb hit. It sounded just like a big artillery shell or a big conventional bomb. I feel really lucky for me and my family." Indeed, aside from Ella Davies, who required minor surgery for internal bleeding, the Greggs survived the explosion with only minor injuries. In another miraculous turn of events, the children had only just abandoned a playhouse in the backyard and moved to a side yard around 200 meters away, an action that likely saved their lives. Unfortunately, however, the Greggs' property was not so fortunate. The blast partially collapsed the house and shifted it off its foundations, damaged 6 other outbuildings, totaled 2 vehicles, flattened dozens of trees, and vaporized a dozen of the Greggs' chickens. But it could have been a lot worse. Had the bomb been armed, the blast and radiation would likely have killed everyone within a 16-kilometer or 10-mile radius. Yet it was not until days later that the Greggs learned exactly what calamity had befallen their homestead. As cousin Ella Davies later recalled, "After I left the hospital, the general from Shaw Air Force Base, where the plane was held, came over and visited. He had a book and a doll for me. He sat around and talked with the family. He was there as a concerned person." After watching in horror as the result of their gigantic Whoopsa-Doodle exploded on the ground below, the crew of the Garfield 13 radioed nearby Shaw and Myrtle Beach Air Force bases for assistance and, following standard procedure, orbited the scene for nearly 3 hours, taking pictures and making observations before returning to Hunter Air Force Base. On the ground below, curious neighbors descended upon the Gregg home, snapping up shiny pieces of bomb debris as souvenirs until Air Force personnel arrived and forced them to stop. In the wake of the incident, Air Force officials assured the Greggs that all claims for damages would be settled promptly and fairly. However, oddly, they did no such thing. Instead, the Air Force set about nickel and diming the Greggs. For example, the Greggs were denied a housing allowance since they had temporarily moved in with Walter's brother and had thus incurred no additional expenses from this. The Air Force also evaluated damage based on the depreciated value of damaged or destroyed items, not their actual replacement value. Finally, they refused to compensate the Greggs for their destroyed vehicles, instead providing them with a rental car for 1 whole week, enough time they claimed for the Greggs to cash in their insurance and buy a new vehicle with that money instead. When all this penny pinching was finally completed, the Air Force offered the Greggs a grand total of only $44,000, equivalent to around $484,000 in today's money. Understandably, the Greggs flatly turned down this offer as it was insufficient to replace and repair everything that had been damaged. And instead, they turned to their local congressman, John McMillan, who sponsored a private bill allowing the family to sue the U.S. government. Incredibly, the bill was swiftly passed and signed into law by President Dwight Eisenhower, whereupon the family hired a lawyer and took the Air Force to court. 3 years and 3 months after being accidentally bombed, the Greggs finally won their case and received $54,000, just $10,000 more than the Air Force had originally offered. Nonetheless, Walter Gregg maintained a positive outlook on the whole affair, joking in an interview that, "I always wanted a swimming pool, and now I've got the hole for one at no cost. I may open it to the public, charge them for swimming in uranium-enriched waters." The crater, filled with water, remains in the woods near Mars Bluff to this day, along with a historical marker erected in 2008, easily overlooked reminders of the day the United States bombed itself. Meanwhile, the Mars Bluff accident made headlines around the world, while the Soviet Union, along with socialist and pacifist organizations around the world, jumped at the opportunity to decry the dangers posed by SAC and the US military as a whole to global safety. But while the US Air Force did not discontinue its global bomber deployments, it was forced to extensively review its safety equipment and procedures. An investigation revealed that while loading the bomb aboard Garfield 13, ground crews had also been unable to insert the harness locking pin. However, they had chosen not to correct the issue in order to meet their assigned deadlines. As a result, the bomb suspension mechanism aboard all SAC B-47s were modified and bomb loading procedures revised. But if the history of technological disasters teaches us anything, it is that it is very difficult to predict what systems will fail next, and the B-47 experienced 2 more major nuclear incidents before being retired in the strategic bombing role in 1969. On November 4th, 1958, a B-47 carrying a 3.8 megaton Mark 39 thermonuclear bomb caught fire and crashed shortly after takeoff from Dyess Air Force Base, Texas. 3 of the 4 crew survived, but the conventional explosives aboard the bomb detonated, blasting a crater 11 meters in diameter. And on November the 26th of that same year, a B-47 caught fire on the ground at Chennault Air Force Base, Louisiana, when its rocket-assisted takeoff, or RATO bottle, misfired, resulting in the destruction of the aircraft and the weapon aboard. But by the early 1960s, the groundbreaking but temperamental B-47 was finally starting to be phased out as SAC's primary strategic bomber in favor of an aircraft destined to become a legend, the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. Affectionately nicknamed the Buff, or Big Ugly Fat by its crews, the B-52 first flew in 1952 and officially entered USAF service in 1956. Considerably larger and more powerful than its predecessor, the aircraft measured 48.5 meters or 159 feet long, with a wingspan of 56 meters or 185 feet, and powered by 8 76 kilonewton or 17,000 pound thrust Pratt & Whitney TF-33 low bypass turbofan engines, thus all allowing the aircraft to carry up to 32,000 kilograms or 70,000 pounds of ordnance over a combat range of 14,200 kilometers or 8,800 miles, which again could be significantly extended through the use of in-flight refueling. Though primarily designed to carry nuclear weapons, the B-52 proved extraordinarily versatile and was used in a variety of other roles, including laying sea mines, carrying reconnaissance drones, and launching experimental aircraft such as the hypersonic North American X-15. It also delivered vast quantities of conventional explosive munitions during the Vietnam War, Gulf War, and several other conflicts. Indeed, the venerable Buff remains in service to this day and is not intended to be retired until the 2050s, a full century after its introduction. However, soon after its introduction, the usefulness of the B-52 and of manned bombers as a whole as a strategic weapon was suddenly thrown into question when, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, into orbit. Though the basketball-sized craft did little but transmit regular radio beeps, its mere presence filled Western military planners with existential dread, for the rocket that had placed Sputnik into orbit could also place a nuclear weapon anywhere on the North American continent with little warning. Worse still, such intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, descended on their targets from the edge of space at hypersonic speeds, making them all but impossible to intercept and shoot down. With North American aerospace defense rendered nearly obsolete overnight, priorities shifted away from manned bombers and anti-aircraft missiles and towards ICBM construction and the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, or MAD. However, Strategic Air Command and its infamous commander, General Curtis LeMay, the inspiration for the insane General Jack D. Ripper in Dr. Strangelove, still saw a role for the manned bomber, and starting in 1958 launched a series of airborne alert missions under a variety of code names, including Head Start, Coverall, and Chrome Dome. This scheme involved keeping a number of nuclear-armed B-52s airborne at all times, flying from bases in the continental United States to patrol routes along the Soviet border near Alaska, Greenland, and the Mediterranean. This way, if American air-based missile silos and other military installations were destroyed by a surprise Soviet first strike, SAC would retain at least a measure of second strike capability, with the Chrome Dome B-52s dashing across the border to strike targets within the Soviet Union. And so it was that on January the 23rd, 1961, a SAC B-52G took off from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina, on a coverall patrol, which would take it on a ladder route up the eastern seaboard to the Canadian Arctic and back. Aboard were 2 Mark 39 Mod 2 thermonuclear bombs, each with a yield of 3.8 megatons. Introduced in 1957, the Mark 39 was an improved version of the Mark 15 involved in the Tybee Island incident, fitted with contact and barometric instead of radar fuses and thermal instead of rechargeable nickel-cadmium batteries. Developed during the Second World War for use in guided missiles, thermal batteries use salt electrolyte, which is a solid at room temperature, preventing them from running down in storage. Just before launch, an externally applied electric current melts the salt and activates the battery, which powers the missile, or in this case, bombs, onboard systems. The Mod 0 Mark 39 featured in-flight core insertion, much like the Mark 4 and Mark 6 bombs, but in the Mod 1 version, this was abandoned in favor of sealed pit design, in which the core, or pit, made of high-enriched uranium instead of plutonium, was permanently installed and not removable under ordinary operational conditions. The Mod 2 version, carried by SAC B-52s in January 1961, was optimized for low altitude and laydown delivery for use against bury or hardened targets like missile silos or command bunkers, and featured special ground contact fuses and a pair of braking parachutes in its tail. These gave the delivery aircraft time to escape the blast of its own bomb and allowed the bomb to lay down softly on the ground without being damaged in the process, and so it was that around midnight on January the 24th, the B-52 rendezvoused with a Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker off the American East Coast to carry out a scheduled mid-air refueling. But while carrying out the hookup, the crew of the tanker informed Major Tulloch that his aircraft had a severe fuel leak in its right wing. Ground control then ordered Tulloch to abort the refueling and assume a holding pattern off the coast to burn off fuel before landing. However, upon reaching his assigned station, Tulloch reported that he was now losing more than 500 kilograms or 1,100 pounds of fuel every minute and was immediately ordered to land back at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. But as the B-52 descended towards the runway, the right wing suddenly tore off, and as the aircraft spiraled towards the ground, Tulloch ordered his crew to bail out. Though all crew aboard the B-52G variant were provided with ejection seats, only 5 managed to escape, with one, Third Pilot Lieutenant Adam Maddox, being the only recorded person to successfully bail out of a B-52 top hatch without an ejection seat. Of these 5, one, Radar Navigator Major Eugene Shelton, died on impact with the ground, while Electronic Warfare Instructor Major Eugene Richards and Gunner Technical Sergeant Francis Barnish failed to escape the aircraft and died in the ensuing crash. One of the survivors, Electronic Warfare Officer First Lieutenant William Wilson, later described his experience. "I don't know how it happened. I know when I landed in the field, I felt awfully good. I felt like running. I went to a house and a fellow got his wife up and they fixed some coffee. They thought at first I was a prowler when I told them I had jumped out of an airplane. I must have been bad looking." While Co-Pilot Major Richard Harden recalled, "I could see 3 or 4 other shoots against the glow of the wreckage. The plane hit 10 or 12 seconds after bailout. I hit some trees, I had a fix on some lights and started walking. My biggest difficulty getting back was the various and sundry dogs I encountered on the road." Meanwhile, the pilotless aircraft broke up into several large sections and impacted the ground near Faro, North Carolina, around 19 kilometers or 12 miles north of Goldsboro, spreading wreckage over an area of 5 square kilometers or 2 square miles. Within hours, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, or EOD, teams from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base arrived and began searching for the aircraft's 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs. Meanwhile, a team of specialists representing the Atomic Energy Commission, Sandia National Laboratories, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the Air Force Nuclear Weapons Center, or AFNWC, flew in from Kirkland Air Force Base in New Mexico, arriving later that evening. Within a day of the crash, the 2 bombs were located in farmland around Faro, but as EOD specialists worked to defuse the warheads, they made a disturbing discovery. To understand what they found, we have to first examine the various safety and arming systems integrated into the Mark 39 bomb. A pair of arming rods extended into the warhead, which would automatically pull free when the bomb was released from the aircraft. These in turn were retained by a set of safing pins, which had to be manually retracted by the crew prior to bomb release using a long lanyard. At the same time, to arm the bomb, the crew had to turn the T-380 readiness switch in the cockpit from the safe to the arm position, which would in turn activate an MC-722 electromechanical arm safe switch inside the bomb itself. A similar switch on each of the two T-249 aircraft monitor and control units, one per bomb, also had to be flipped from ground to air to pre-arm the weapons before takeoff. Finally, the crew could activate a lock mechanism inside the bomb tail assembly to automatically deploy the braking parachutes for low altitude or laydown delivery. As the bomb cleared the bomb bay, the retraction of the arming rods closed a set of switches that activated an MC-845 Bish pulse generator, a bank of capacitors which delivered an electrical pulse to activate an MC-640 low voltage thermal battery. Rod retraction also activated an MC-543 42-second timer and closed valves sealing the reference chamber of the MC-832 differential pressure switch, which gauged the distance the bomb had fallen by measuring barometric pressure. Once the bomb had fallen a given distance, the MC-832 switch closed and passed current from the MC-640 battery to the MC-788 high voltage safing switch, which in turn connected a still dormant MC-641 high voltage thermal battery to the X unit, a capacitor bank that simultaneously fired the detonators on the primary stage explosive lens system. Next, when the MC-543 timer finally counted down 42 seconds, it would close a switch to activate the MC-641 high voltage thermal battery, which in turn could charge the X unit. Simultaneously, a 1A valve would open to inject a mixture of deuterium and tritium gas into the primary cores to achieve fission boosting. Finally, on impact with the ground, a crush fuse in the bomb's nose would connect the X unit to the detonators, setting off the fission primary and the fusion secondary and triggering a 3.8 megaton detonation. So going back to this accident, the two Mark 39 bombs involved in the incident were designated Weapon 1 and Weapon 2 by the accident investigators. Weapon number 1, serial number 434909, was carried in the aircraft's aft bomb bay, while Weapon 2, serial number 359943, was carried in the forward bay. Weapon 2 separated from the falling wreckage at an altitude of around 1,000 meters or 3,300 feet, but while the parachute activation mechanism had been activated, for unknown reasons the parachute failed to deploy. As a result, the bomb fell to Earth at terminal velocity, burying itself deep in the mud, so deep in fact that it took recovery crews 6 days to recover the bomb's primary stage, 6 meters or 20 feet beneath the surface. Given the size of the crater, it was initially assumed that the conventional explosives in the primary had detonated on impact, but thankfully this was soon determined to not be the case, though the primary was heavily damaged. Meanwhile, the bomb's fission secondary stage had ripped free and buried itself even deeper in the mud. But after 2 weeks of digging, this component could still not be found. Recovery was greatly complicated by freezing temperatures and the high water table, with pumps struggling to prevent the excavation pit from flooding. Ultimately, after reaching a depth of 21 meters or 70 feet, it was decided to abandon the search. The secondary remains there to this day, buried somewhere under the North Carolina soil. Concerningly, examination of the recovered components revealed that the weapon's safing pins had been removed, allowing the arming rods to withdraw as the bomb flew free of the disintegrating wreckage. This in turn activated the MC-845 Bish pulse generator, the MC-640 low voltage thermal battery, the MC-832 differential pressure switch, and the MC-543 42-second timer. Fortunately, the bomb was released at low altitude, and the MC-543 timer thus only ran down 10 of its 42 seconds before being destroyed on impact, along with the MC-788 high voltage safing system. As a result, the MC-641 high voltage thermal battery was not activated and the X unit was not charged, meaning the bomb could not have undergone a proper nuclear detonation. Furthermore, the valve mechanism had not activated, meaning no potential hazardous tritium gas was released into the environment. But it wasn't all good news. As Lieutenant Jack Reville, an EOD technician who helped defuse the bomb, later recalled, "Until my death, I will never forget hearing my sergeant say, 'Lieutenant, we found the arm safe switch.' And I said, 'Great.' He said, 'Not great. It's on arm.'" This discovery suggested a disturbing possibility that the arm safe switch had somehow been activated without a deliberate command from the cockpit, meaning that if the bomb had had the time to complete its full arming sequence, it could have gone off. However, subsequent analysis by Sandy National Laboratory revealed that the shock of the impact had sheared the switch from its electrical contacts, preventing it from conducting a firing signal despite being in the armed position. In other words, on this bomb, the parachute's unexplained failure to deploy saved North Carolina from nuclear disaster. The same, however, could not be said for Weapon 1, which was discovered intact and upright with its parachute tangled in nearby trees. As with Weapon 2, the arming rods were withdrawn upon release from the aircraft. However, Weapon 1 was ejected at an altitude of around 2,700 meters or 9,000 feet, while, unlike Weapon 2, its parachute deployed as intended. As a result, by the time the bomb reached the ground, it had completed its entire arming sequence. Both the barometric and timing switches had closed, both thermal batteries had been activated, the X unit had been charged, and the crush fuse in the nose had closed. Only a single component prevented a firing signal from reaching the primary detonators, the MC722 switch, still set to the safe position. That single, simple component, which could easily have been triggered by any stray 28 voltage signal, stood between North Carolina and Armageddon. Had the bomb actually detonated, the immediate blast, thermal and radiation pulse would have destroyed or severely damaged everything within a 30-kilometer or 18-mile radius, started fires out to 100 kilometers or 60 miles, and blanketed most of North Carolina and its neighboring states with lethal radioactive fallout, potentially killing hundreds of thousands. Unsurprisingly, the U.S. Air Force was keen to cover up the truth about the Goldsboro crash, and official press releases and newspaper reports falsely assured the American public that the two bombs involved in the incident were unarmed and posed no immediate threat. Behind closed doors, however, the Air Force scrambled to correct the dangerous flaws in the Mark 39 bomb and B-52's design. As part of an upgraded program known as ALT-197, the MC-72 arm safe switch was replaced with a new version called the MC-1288, which prevented the MC-640 low-voltage thermal battery from being activated when the switch was turned to the safe position. This, in turn, prevented any component of the arming system from receiving electrical power unless the T-380 readiness switch in the cockpit was manually turned to arm. Nonetheless, the Mark 39 was deemed unacceptably unsafe for the airborne alert mission and soon replaced with the more sophisticated B-28. Meanwhile, the B-52G and H models featured so-called wet wings without separate fuel tanks in order to significantly increase fuel capacity and range over previous models. However, as the Goldsboro crash dramatically demonstrated, these were highly susceptible to high stresses and metal fatigue and were significantly strengthened then via Boeing's Stability, Augmentation, and Flight Control program in 1967. Yet despite the extreme risks involved, SAC's airborne alert program carried on unimpeded, and unsurprisingly, many more accidents ensued. But it would take a further 2 major incidents on foreign soil to finally put an end to the airborne alert mission. On January the 17th, 1966, a SAC B-52G bomber flying a Chrome Dome mission over the Mediterranean collided with a KC-135 tanker aircraft and crashed near the Spanish village of Palomares, killing all 4 men aboard the tanker and 3 of the 7 bomber crew. 4 1.1 megaton B-28 thermonuclear weapons were ejected from the aircraft. 1 fell to Earth intact. The conventional explosive in 2 detonated on impact, contaminating the surrounding countryside with vaporized plutonium, while the 4th fell into the Mediterranean and was only recovered after an extensive 80-day search. 2 years later, on January the 21st, 1968, another B-52G flying a Chrome Dome mission over Thule, Greenland, caught fire and crashed into North Star Bay. 1 crew member was killed and all 4 B-28 weapons aboard were destroyed, contaminating large areas of the sea ice with plutonium and triggering a major diplomatic crisis. And to learn much more about these 2 incidents, please check out our previous videos, Fire, Ice, and Plutonium, and that time the US Air Force lost a nuke in the Mediterranean. Of course, the end of Operation Chrome Dome did not bring an end to nuclear mishaps, which continued on through the end of the Cold War and into the modern day. For example, on January the 25th, 1995, a civilian Black Brant research rocket launched from Andøya, Norway, was detected by Russian early warning radars and interpreted as a Trident ballistic missile launched toward Moscow by a US Navy submarine. The Russian defense system went into high alert, and then President Boris Yeltsin was moments away from launching a retaliatory strike when the rocket veered away from its course and the alert was called off. And much more recently, on August the 29th, 2007, a US Air Force B-52H bomber flew from Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota to Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana, carrying 6 Raytheon AGM-129 ACM cruise missiles, which had accidentally been left armed with 150 kiloton W-80 thermonuclear warheads.
I'm in danger!
These and other incidents all illustrate a contradiction in the deployment of nuclear weapons, known as the always-never problem. To be an effective deterrent, nuclear weapons must always work when they are commanded to, otherwise an enemy might be tempted to launch a preemptive strike. At the same time, however, given their apocalyptic destructive potential, they must never go off when not commanded to. This impossible balancing act has underpinned most of the nuclear near misses that have plagued humanity over the last 80 years with this nuclear deterrent strategy. In the end, as the Whopper so sagely put after running through all possible nuclear wargame scenarios,
strange game. The only winning move is not to play.